welcome. I'm Cheyenne Daniels, race and politics reporter at The Hill. Thank you for joining me for our annual virtual summit, The Race and Justice Imperative. A record number of Black Americans were elected to office last year, and 2023 brings the largest class of the Congressional Black Caucus in its history. As Black Americans continue to break new barriers, what can we expect to see in the fight for justice across politics, society, and achieving the American dream? Today, our speakers will tackle a number of issues, including the fight for economic equality and building Black political power. We will also celebrate groundbreaking political moments and history-making candidates. We have an incredible lineup of speakers today, but before we get to them, a few quick housekeeping notes. You can tweet us at The Hill Events using the hashtag TheHillBHM for Black History Month. We are broadcasting live and will be taking your questions throughout the program. My first guest today is an author, political strategist, and organizer. She is the principal and founder of the Black Futures Lab, principal at Black to the Future Action Fund, and the co-founder of the Black Lives Matter global movement. Please welcome Alicia Garza.
It's so good to be here with you, Cheyenne. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Alicia, we are talking in February, which many of us know as Black History Month. But from what I understand, you prefer to call February Black Futures Month. Can you talk to me a little bit about why that terminology instead of Black History Month?
Absolutely. I mean, both are important, right? It's important for us to understand where we've come from so that we can determine where we're headed. But I do find that during the month of February, we are inundated with what tend to be a lot of fairy tales about how it is that Black communities have impacted social change. And the reality is, right, Rosa Parks wasn't tired, and that's not why the bus boycott happened. Rosa Parks was an organizer, right? These are the kinds of stories that we hear during this month, which really look backward at our past and then kind of reshape and reconfigure the courageous and bold actions that people took in order to create change. So instead of doing that this month, of course, we're always going to have, Black facts, which are important. We're always going to have and appreciate and celebrate the ancestors and the heroes and heroines who came before us. But it's also really critical, especially at this juncture in history, to be charting our path forward. And that's why we call this Black Futures Month. We really want to engage Black communities in the project of talking about what's next and how we get there and what it's going to take for us to ensure that we have bright, healthy, successful futures that are equitable and just.
And from what I understand, part of how you're working to make sure that that equitable and just future comes to fruition is through the work with the Black Census. Can you talk a little bit about what the Black Census is and how it's helping structure the projects that you're working on?
The Black Census Project is the largest survey of Black people in America in 158 years. And when we are done with this current iteration of the Black Census Project, we will be the largest survey of Black people in American history. The Black Census Project is really just a massive listening project of Black communities across the nation, trying to better understand what it is that we experience every day in our democracy, in our society, in our economy, and to gather ideas from the people who we survey about what solutions we want to see to the problems that we face every single day. From healthcare to a lack of affordable housing to mass incarceration, it's the people who are closest to the problem who have the clearest sense of what the solution should be. And so we really are doing the Lord's work, I would say, in making sure that Black people's voices are heard. When we did the census for the first time in 2018, Cheyenne, I can tell you that the most common thing we heard from our survey respondents was that nobody had ever asked them what they experience every single day or what they want to see for their futures. So imagine if the majority of the 30,000 people that we talked to in the first iteration of the Black Census said nobody's ever asked them what they think or what they want. what does that mean for how we're creating public policy in this country? So we aim to upend that, and the Black Census Project will be a treasure trove of data that helps us better understand what Black communities are experiencing every single day, who Black communities are in this country, because we're not just African Americans, and it will also chart a path towards legislative solutions for what we need to do to address those challenges. The Black Census feeds directly into a project that we call the Black Agenda, and we will be designing that again for 2024. And it's a legislative roadmap for how we make Black lives matter in every sector of our society.
Alicia, we've talked previously for several articles that I've written, which can be found on the Hill's website, about what some of the top concerns, top priorities are for Black Americans. Can you just share with some of our listeners today what those issues have been?
Absolutely. You know, Cheyenne, we just came through a very tumultuous midterm election cycle. And while that may be in the rearview mirror for many, I am still haunted by all of the narratives and messages that were being put forward about Black people, what we care about, what we want, whether we're going to participate or whether we're not going to participate. And unfortunately, Cheyenne, those narratives also shape public policy. When we start, creating havoc, right, around crime and violence in urban cities, right, then we get more punitive public policy. But the fact of the matter, Cheyenne, is this. COVID-19, of course, upended our entire society and it upended our economy. But what we find is that the crime and violence rates that are being purported through many mainstream media channels are actually highly overblown, right? And then the solutions towards those challenges, because there is crime and violence in our communities, the solutions for those challenges are not the ones that you would think, at least not according to Black communities. So what we're finding in projects like the Black Census Project, what we find in our regular polling of Black people, like we did in our Black Voter Bulletin this year, or in our temperature check polls, which was the largest recurring survey of Black people, longest recurring survey of Black people at 1,000 participants every single month, is that crime and violence wasn't actually at the forefront of Black people's concerns, and it certainly wasn't driving Black communities to the polls. The number one issue that Black communities care about, and the number one issue that got Black people out of their homes to go and vote, were issues of the economy, jobs, cost of living, inflation, quickly followed, right, by white nationalism and white supremacy. And then, of course, there definitely was a concern about voting rights. And then as we saw the Dobbs decision go down, there was some concern amongst Black communities about abortion rights. But crime and violence wasn't even in the top 5 issues. But yet when you turned on the television, you would think that Black communities in particular are some of the biggest supporters of bills that, dump tons and tons more resources into policing, surveillance, and control. Actually, Black communities want to see resources going towards services in our communities that can prevent crime. Black communities want to see police officers being held accountable when they commit crimes in our communities, like we saw in the case of Tyree Nichols in Memphis, Tennessee, and also like we saw in the case of Keenan Anderson in Los Angeles, California, and so many others. So it's important to be doing this kind of research and to be offering this kind of data so that we're getting it right when it comes to public policy. We know that Black communities are complicated, but we're also not a monolith. And we are one of the strongest voting blocs that the Democratic Party has. So it's deeply important that Black voices, Black concerns, Black experiences, but also Black people's perspectives on solutions be included and put front and center when it comes to creating public policy that will impact all of us, but often disproportionately impact Black communities.
When you think about the way that these concerns have been voiced, and as you mentioned, for many of the individuals that you spoke to, there was this sense of gratitude because they hadn't had somebody ask them before. What happens when you translate that to our policymakers? Are they shocked to hear that Black folks care about the economy, or are they shocked to hear some of these concerns that perhaps they hadn't even considered as important to Black voters?
You know, unfortunately, because we live in a society that insists on race neutral or race blind policies, oftentimes, yes, politicians and elected officials who don't already have a connection to Black communities are surprised at the results of the polling and the research that we do. And I think some of that might have to do with the fact, right, that it's important to keep putting on the radar for elected officials that part of your constituency, and in some cases your strongest constituencies, your most active, the ones who are more likely to donate to your campaigns, the ones who are more likely to volunteer for your campaigns, are Black communities. And that's why this is so deeply important to us. We want to make sure that Black communities are a part of the democracy that we uphold every single day. And at a moment like this in this country, Cheyenne, where democracy is under attack from every single angle, you cannot afford to lose the support of Black communities.
Alicia, you touched on what we saw happen with Tyre Nichols, what we saw happen with Keenan Anderson, and this idea of police accountability. We just saw the State of the Union where we heard the president mention that. We saw not just Tyre Nichols' family, but families of other individuals who have been impacted by police violence attend the State of the Union. How does this factor into the conversations that you are having as you guys build these projects and work on building Black community empowerment?
You know, it's important that we understand that for so many Black communities, crime and violence is an economic issue. Policing is an economic issue. And the way that we advance public safety is an economic issue. In so many cities across the nation, Cheyenne, a vast majority of funding, general funding for the operation of cities is going towards policing strategies that are not working. Policing addresses crimes that have already happened, but it is not intended, nor is it successful in being preventative at crimes. And as Black communities know very well, when we invest in local economies, when we invest in education, when we invest in the things that people need to live full and vibrant lives, we see that crime rates and instances of crime decrease. It's a very simple equation. But unfortunately, our web of public policy that is trying to address these types of issues is not so simple. And it's not simple because right now in this country, public policy is being driven mostly by private entities and their interests. And so our work is really important because we choose to upend that dynamic. We want to make sure, like I said earlier, that Black communities are front and center when it comes to building out the democracy in this country that we all deserve and protecting it. And in order for that to happen, we have to make sure that Black voices are not just at the table, but shaping it. What we saw at the State of the Union address, I thought was actually really important. You know, I've been in this work for a very long time. I attended the State of the Union address, President Obama's final State of the Union address, when I was working closely with the Black Lives Matter Global Network. And, you know, I have to say that it was incredible to hear the President of the United States finally talk about police violence and its impact on our communities, saying things like everybody deserves to go home. That's something that should be counted as a movement victory. And as somebody who's been in this work for a long time, I can tell you it took us a really long time to get there. But now we have to finish the job, as President Biden said, and we have to make sure that the way that we ensure that public safety is not punitive, is not hyper-militarization of our communities or wasteful spending, right, on military-grade weapons that turn our communities into war zones. We have to make sure that Black communities are at the table. And I don't just mean the voices that you always see at the table. I mean people who are being directly impacted by these issues, but I also mean people who have done the work to be innovative about how it is that we can increase public safety without increasing the level of violence and terror that Black communities are experiencing, unfortunately, at the hands of the people who have been tasked to protect and serve. Across the spectrum and across the board, from police to communities, I think we agree that we are spending in a way that does not make sense. And so we have an opportunity right here, right now, to change the equation. And it's my hope, coming out of the State of the Union address, coming out of this last decade of organizing, and the decades before this, right, of organizing to change the way we think about public safety, that we actually can claim some more victories along the way.
Alicia, very quickly, I just want to ask, again, 2022 midterms, we saw historic numbers of Black candidates running up and down the ballot. Many of them were elected. Is this leaving you with some hope that we can begin to see this change that you're talking about when it comes to public safety, but also when it comes to continuing to build Black power?
You know, at the Black to the Future Action Fund, Cheyenne, we think that a couple of things are important. Yes, it is important to have Black representation, but not just on its own. We have to have Black representation, people who are making the rules in state houses and in Congress, who also share an agenda for power, that share an agenda for moving us forward as it relates to these questions like public safety or what we do about healthcare. We need Black officials who have a forward-thinking agenda as it relates to communities that have been left out and left behind. What good does it do to have us have Black people on the Supreme Court if they vote against our voting rights? What good does it do to have Black people in the halls of power when they vote against Black people having basic fundamental rights? So we can't just have one over the other. We have to have both. And that's the work that we do at the Black to the Future Action Fund.
Alicia, thank you so much for joining our program this Black Futures Month. We appreciate you being here, and we hope you take care.
Thank you for having me.
My next guest is a Republican from Florida and a member of the House Committee on Oversight and Accountability and the Committee on Financial Services. Please welcome Congressman Byron Donalds.
How you doing? It's good to be with you.
Thank you so much for being here, Congressman. Again, Black History Month. We would be remiss to not mention the moment that we had just a few weeks ago where we saw history made with almost 2 Black men leading our Congress. We had a moment where we saw both Representative Hakeem Jeffries and yourself nominated for Speaker of the House. Can you talk a little bit about what that moment meant to you to see that moment of progress with 2 Black men at the forefront of this conversation?
Well, I mean, look, that time period was a wild one, obviously. Some people aren't really accustomed to seeing in the first week of a new Congress. But being able to be a part of that was profound. It was a little surreal at first because, to be blunt, I was still trying to get my head around what was happening with me at that particular time. But then to kind of take a step back and understand that even though there was a week of heavy negotiations and a lot of movement, that you had myself and Representative Jeffries being nominated from both sides of the political aisle, it is historic. It was monumental. And that's something he and I had a chance to briefly talk about when all the votes were done and everything was settled, especially, 2 Black men from Brooklyn, New York. It was special, and it's something that I think should never be discounted or just overlooked.
Absolutely, absolutely. Congressman, when we talk about Black voters, oftentimes there's this narrative that Black voters.
I think I lost you guys.
I'm so sorry. Oh, we're having a little bit of technical difficulty. It sounds like I'm not able to hear the Congressman, and he is not able to hear me. Congressman, are you able to hear me a little bit better? We are having a moment. I'm so sorry. So it is Black History Month, which means that, we are here to celebrate the not just successes that we have seen from Black Americans to this point, but the future that we are going to see from Black Americans, the way that they are shaping our country to this day. We were just listening to Congressman Byron Donalds from Florida.
All right, I think I got you guys back. I apologize. My fault. I apologize.
Oh, we have the Congressman back. Perfect.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Congressman. We were discussing how there's often this narrative narrative when it comes to Black voters that Black voters don't vote for Republicans. You and I know that's false. What can we do to help dispel that narrative? And are there things that the Republican Party is doing to help encourage Black voters to vote for them more?
Well, look, this is where I'm critical of Republicans. And I've been that way for quite some time. The Republican Party historically really hasn't done much of anything to try to court Black voters. I think that members of my party have talked about the issues that they support, the values that they support, but they've not taken the time to go into communities and say, hey, let's build a relationship. Let me explain to you what we mean when we talk about a lower tax base and policy. What do we mean when we talk about financial regulatory reforms? What does it mean when we talk about education reform and what that means to children who grow up at various parts of our economy across the country? That's work in the Republican Party that's starting to change, that's starting to move, in my view, in a positive way. Because, taking a step back and understanding, Black culture and even Black people, we are across the political spectrum when it comes to values and thought processes. But I think what happens is that, the Democrat Party has consistently sought Black votes for a very long time. The Republican Party hasn't done that work, but that's something that's changing. It's something that I advocate for every single day. And that's going to continue to evolve if I have anything to say about it.
Absolutely. Congressman, we were just hearing from Alicia Garza, and a few of our other speakers today will also touch a little bit on racial justice. What can you tell us that the Republican Party is doing when it comes to racial justice?
Well, the number one thing we want to make sure we have is that our police are supported in every community in the country. I grew up in the inner city. You can't have safe streets without the police. I think the thing that nobody wants to see, obviously, are elements of police brutality. Nobody wants to see the targeting of people. And so when the federal government comes in and says, okay, let's provide funding for body cameras or for training, that's the stuff that Republicans are about. My colleague in the Senate, Tim Scott, authored a bill about this very topic right after, during the summer of 2020. He authored that bill. That bill didn't get out of the Senate, and I'm not going to get into the politics as to why, but it didn't get out of the Senate. That's something that's on the table that many Republicans, virtually all Republicans that I speak to, support. We want to make sure that law enforcement has the tools to do its job, because if you don't have safe streets, how is a young Black kid in Chicago or New York or Miami or Oakland or Los Angeles going to be able to just, get to school on time? Be able to get, feel safe in their own community? We want that to occur. At the same time, we want to make sure that everything's being done, that the justice system is operating equally across the board. And so that's where House Republicans are. That's where Republicans are in general. And we're committed to that work.
The country is still reeling from the video that we saw of Tyre Nichols beating, and you yourself did comment and you called the actions abhorrent. Where do you see the federal government playing a part in this police reform? Does it have to come from the federal level, or does this need to be more of a community, state-based reform that we see?
Well, I think it's important for people to understand, and I have the ability, having served at the state level in Florida and now at the federal level. Most police reform proposals, most training funding apparatuses, that happens at the state level and at the local level. The federal government can provide additional funding or supplemental funding, but most of that happens at state government and local government. So if a community wants to really have a hands-on approach to making sure that the training is operating the way it should for new officers coming into the force, that's mostly handled at the local level with your police chief, with your sheriff. That's where that stuff occurs. I think the one thing we also have to take stock of and understand is that if you have a situation in your community where the standards for officers coming into the force is lowered, it leaves all of us susceptible to some of the things that we saw in that video. What happened there was a tragedy for our country, a tragedy, obviously, for the Nichols family and for everybody that knows them and cares for them. But we got to be careful when we set public policy with respect to policing. It has to be at the local level. That's where the people are hired. That's where they are trained. That's where people's sheriffs and chiefs of police typically are elected by that community in that area. The federal government's side is to come in and provide support, mostly through funding, but actually not through policy. And so it's important for everybody to understand if you want to have that direct action, it starts at the local level primarily.
When we talk about racial justice, there's a lot that goes into that, and a very large part of that is economic justice as well. It means being able to have access, particularly to things like the labor market, being able to build businesses. I know that the COVID-19 pandemic wreaked havoc on small businesses across our country. But right now, there's been a lot of discussion about how particularly Black-owned businesses suffered during the pandemic. They did bear the brunt of some of the economic crisis of the pandemic that we saw. And though there is still recovery happening, we're not entirely out of the pandemic just yet. So questions are now circulating about how we can continue to support Black businesses and help them recover as we move forward through the hopefully end of this pandemic.
This is a great question. It's something that actually I take a lot of focus on with my responsibilities being on the House Financial Services Committee. A couple of things. The number one issue we have with funding or helping, small businesses, micro businesses, where you have a lot of black entrepreneurs trying to create a micro business to get started, their fledgling ideas, or to continue to build their business. A lot of that starts with the fact that our banking system is really a top-down heavy system. And this is in part because of bad financial regulatory policy from the previous financial collapse back in 2008. If you look at a chart of community banks across the country, they've been destroyed to the tune of 80% in our banking system over the past 12 to 15 years. Meanwhile, the large banks have only gotten massively bigger. So what does that mean to a mom and pop in any city in America? What that means to a small Black business owner is unless you have a very deep banking relationship with somebody at Bank of America or Wells Fargo or Citigroup, it's hard to get access to capital, especially with something like the pandemic where money was going through the banks, but there's not a lot of banks that operate in a lot of communities. There's hardly any community banks that operate in communities anymore. If we want Black business owners to be able to access capital, if we want Black people to have more tools to get at the economic system, we have to actually do a strong, hard look at reforming the financial regulatory markets. Number one, we have to start opening up more pathways for financial technology so people can access dollars, whether it's through their smartphone or through their computer, without actually having to go to a banking location. Number two, we need more community banks because, like I said, if you're a micro business, you employ 3 to 4 people. It is so difficult to build a banking relationship with a national bank. And I want to stress to people, if you have a bank account, that is not a banking relationship. A banking relationship is when you know the loan officer, when you know the branch manager, and you engage with them on a regular basis. That's a banking relationship. But financial regulatory policy in Washington has destroyed a lot of that. We have to build it back. Those are some of the solutions that I believe are going to be critical for Black people to be able to achieve economic equality in the United States.
Are you hopeful? Do you have hope that we're going to be able to see that economic equality come true? That these ideas that you have could be passed and come to terms in Congress? I know it's divided right now, but are you hopeful at least?
I mean, I'm hopeful because the proof of what I'm saying is right there for everybody to see. I think the big argument in Washington is about consumer protections. And that's an argument between Republicans and Democrats. Republicans favor a much more open regulatory environment. Democrats tend to favor one based on consumer protections, which is a harder regulatory environment. But the problem with the consumer protection piece is it cuts down the avenues for people to access capital. So look, when I was growing up in the inner city, what was more important to me? Not being able to get into a loan product, or being able to actually have access to all the different options in front of me as I was building my life. I want to have access to the options. I think it's incumbent upon me and my family to make sure that we're doing things to protect ourselves. But I need the options. I need the avenues. I need the ladders to be successful. So I think in Congress, as long as, keep it moving forward with that argument, I think we can be successful because it's people who are either starting at the bottom or they've grown up in a two-parent home and they've had some ability to have some additional cash to help them, or they got introduced to somebody with a good idea and they could partner with that person. There's different levels that people are operating from today in the Black community. What we got to make sure we do is have the channels open and have the access points open through more possibilities and more conduits so those things can be achieved.
Congressman, my final question for you, again, thank you so much for being here today. If you had to offer some words of encouragement for any of our Black Americans looking to go into starting their own business, what would you want to tell them?
The first thing I would say is, listen, it's don't give in, don't give up. If it's going to be hard. It's not going to be easy. Most small businesses fail, but it's through that process of pushing through the hard work that all the possibilities really open for you. In this life, nothing's given to any of us. We have to go out there and earn it every single day. It definitely is possible. It's something that can be done, but you have to find a way to persevere, to pursue it and push through it. Second piece of advice, I would contact whoever is your congressional representative, contact that office, ask what all the different tools that are available out there, because there are a lot of tools available, whether it's SBA or other programs that exist through the banking system. Really do your homework on that, find those additional tools, find those additional helps. Look, at the end of the day, the American economy is the most vibrant thing on the face of the planet in the history of the planet Earth. And so the big thing we want to do on Capitol Hill is make sure that the regulatory state and the law doesn't stand in the way of your success. But your success is always going to start with you, your drive, your ingenuity, your God-given talent. And if you continue to pursue it, you're going to achieve it.
Congressman Byron Donalds, thank you so much for your time this afternoon.
Anytime. Thank you.
Our next few guests are community organizers who have worked on the front lines of our democracy through multiple election cycles, and they can speak to engaging voters and building Black political power. With that, I would like to welcome Demario Cooper, Co-Executive Director at the Center for Popular Democracy. Demario, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Demario, broad question to start off with. We are always hearing lately that democracy is at risk, our democracy is at risk. What would you say the state of our democracy is today?
Our democracy is at risk. No, I think we're in a place in our democracy that we've seen before, but it doesn't look familiar. A lot of my colleagues and I have been talking about this being a post-Reconstruction moment. There was a moment in American democracy where you've seen the manifestation of Black political power at the highest levels. This was a time right after the Civil War when Black folks, Black men particularly, were given the right to vote. And they voted, right? And then put people in all levels of government. And then there was a clapback, what we call a clapback. There was a time when the Confederate forces and those who believed in the previous condition of servitude of Black people aligned themselves and then entrenched Black people, made a deal and entrenched Black people into another 100 years of second-class citizenship and inability to use our democracy. I think, we're in another place like that, which is kind of on the heels of Barack Obama being elected president, another show of Black folks' political power in this country. After that, we run into the birther movement, questioning whether or not our president was a citizen based on his birth certificate, which is a 14th Amendment right issue. And then we see kind of, the erosion of our ability to have a normal functioning politic in the country. And you see, the Tea Party comes and then, Donald Trump is elected, and then some people tried to raid the Capitol, which looked very similar to things that happened in Tallahassee, in Florida, in the 1800s and Louisiana. So, yeah, I think right now we are in a place where our democracy it has sustained an attack, but it is fragile. And there are folks who are very clearly not concerned about the rules of our politics, of our country.
When
Absolutely.
we think about that fragility that you mentioned, is this something that is our electoral system? Is this like how do we begin to address some of these things that you were just mentioning?
I mean, one of the things that we definitely need to address is the fact that in our country, in our democracy, where voting is the key staple of American life and our democracy's success, everyone doesn't have the automatic right to vote. One of the things we could do to protect voters and people in America is make sure that we have standards that all states have to follow around creating access and making sure access is maintained to vote, just simply like an initial American value.
It's interesting that you were making a comparison between what we saw on January 6th to something that we saw happen in the 1800s. Are there lessons that we should be learning at this moment in time to make sure that moving forward we don't see something like either of those events happen again?
Yeah, I mean, I think, I think one of the things that we have to be really clear about is really discussing the history of racism in America and the history of how to vote. When we talk about the electorate, America's voting electorate, how laws and rules have been created that allowed Black people to be marginalized. And, there was a Jim Crow era. There were laws that prevented Black people from, well, maybe not, it would not say that you could not vote, but it would be so difficult for you to actually get a ballot or get on the rolls that there had to be an entire social movement created in the 60s, in the 50s, really the 40s, 50s, and 60s that gave people access to citizenship. And I think what we need to learn from that is that, when we see these kind of forces that are not concerned with, civil society, they're not actually, some people get to run around calling themselves patriots, but they don't actually believe in the first line of the Constitution. I think we need to be very clear about making sure that everyone has access to vote and that is protected in every state across the country. I think we need to move now to do that. I think our Congress, our representatives, should figure out how we can make sure that voting is a mandatory right, that we have voting as a holiday, that people have the access and ability to go and participate in our democracy.
Demario, we heard President Joe Biden, when he was on the campaign trail, talk about racial justice and that he had a racial justice agenda. It was going to be very important to him. It's something that he and the Vice President Kamala Harris have continued to discuss, and we've seen some policies come from them. At this moment in time, how, as we battle with some of these issues that you've mentioned, how is that racial justice agenda shaping up, or are voters that you might speak to, are they aware of it? Do they feel like it's having an impact in their life?
I think across the board, we have to do a better job of connecting the policies and legislators and people who are making the rules to the everyday experience of people who live under these decisions and policies. I think generally we have to do that. I'm the co-executive director at the Center for Popular Democracy. One of our key missions is to really address systemic racial capitalism, which means that we need to make sure that our folks are educated around what is really happening, what has really happened to land our society in the current position, and that we have to make sure that we're educating the base of folks to be able to protect these things. So when we hear our president talk about ending racial or addressing racism, I think some of the policies that we want to see, especially as Black people, we want to see police reform. We want to see policies created, like your last guest was talking about, creating more access to opportunity through banks. But I also agree, most people, Black people, are still concerned about the way that police operate in community. I'm not a person who believes that we have to have police to have safety necessarily. I think there are ways that we can increase safety, even if you need police when people violate or to protect the law. There are things that we can also do just in society, like the public goods inside of society, that would increase people's ability to have safety. When we talk to people in community and we ask them what produces safety to them, no one ever says police. People in my community do not say police. They'll say, when you actually ask someone when they felt safe, they'll say, oh, I was at a community, I was in a community function, I was at church, I was with my friends and family, I was with a community. Like that, those things that we could do to invest in creating more people's access to be in community and have the resources they need will create safety and increase safety. When you think about kids who are doing things in community, most of them are trying to find economic opportunity and they're breaking the law to try to do that. Why don't we make access to opportunity more accessible to them? as a strategy to create more safety.
You know, it's one of the things that you were just talking about that stood out to me was the disconnect between policymakers and the communities that are affected by the policies. And we often hear, especially from Black voters, that politicians and leaders will come around during an election cycle and then kind of disappear until it's time for another election cycle. How do you see encouragement working toward reminding our leaders, our policymakers, you gotta be here more than just, every 2 years or every 4 years?
Yeah, I mean, one piece is what happens in between the election, right? Like part of what happens, people ramp up 3 months before an election, dump a bunch of money into a community, create a bunch of flyers, have a bunch of people walk around canvassing, run huge canvas programs, meaning like folks who are out knocking on doors. And then all of that capacity and infrastructure will just kind of disappear after the election is over. One of the things that we need to do, and I think it's on all of us, from elected officials, funders, foundations, folks who are involved in politics, to make sure that we're engaging communities throughout the year. Like we need year-round engagement in community, right? It's not necessarily just the elected official coming into the community. It's making sure that the community has the capacity and understands the structure on how to take those issues to those elected officials. So investing in strong organizations and creating a relational infrastructure that allows people to understand what's going on in our society is critical to us. When we talk about the vulnerability of our democracy, it will be critical for regular people, particularly Black people and people of color, to understand how our government and the structure works, right? And then to have a long-term engagement and strategy and plan to build the power that's necessary for them to actually be able to influence the decisions that govern their lives. I think that we have to make sure that we're including this longer-term strategy in our electoral strategy. I think elected officials have to be aware of that and have to be paying attention to that too. Also, just go back home and talk to people and make sure you're not just talking to the same folks that you always talk to.
As we've mentioned, we saw the 2022 midterms bring in record number of Black candidates and then Black elected officials. Does that impact when we talk about some of these things? We always hear representation is important. Are we seeing the fruits of that effort bear out just yet?
I think we are in a place where it is good that we're getting people into positions at higher levels of government. That is, I mean, never to forget that actually we had Black senators and congressional representatives at one point in this country in the 1800s. That should just be said over and over again because young people need to know that. That being said, yes, we are putting people into position, like folks are getting into higher positions across the country, getting into offices. Yes, representation does matter, but the policies that create it and those people who are put into those positions, ability to move policies and things that are directly related to Black folks' experience in America is also critical. I think the only way that once we get someone into office, the only way to keep them accountable, hold them accountable, and move progressive policy will be if we have strong institutions that are representing the interests of folks who are directly impacted. And so at the same time, while we are putting people in position, and a lot of those folks going into position, if you think about, Maryland or even in Cleveland, where you see these ballot initiatives that are directly connected to things that are happening on the ground, increasing the electorate and turning folks out. And then there's also institutions on the ground that have been doing, in Ohio, it's like the Ohio Organizing Collaborative, but, other organizations like the New Georgia Project in Georgia, you can see Texas, the Texas Organizing Project, or Lucha in Arizona. There are these relational power building organizations underneath these wins that we also have to tend to if we want to see these wins continue to happen and for us to continue to move forward as a nation.
Absolutely. Demario Cooper, co-executive director for the Center for Popular Democracy. Thank you so much for being here today. We appreciate your time.
Thank you. It was appreciated.
To continue our discussion on the state of our democracy, I'm pleased to welcome Adrian Shropshire, Executive Director of Black PAC. Black PAC is focused on engaging and mobilizing Black voters around the nation. So Adrian, thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thank you for having me.
Absolutely. You know, I don't know if you know this, we've only mentioned it a few times, but it's Black History Month.
It is.
But as we're talking about Black
waning days, the waning days.
Waning days, yes, it's almost wrapped. But as we're talking about Black History Month today, and hopefully every day, we're hearing that there are some issues, obviously, in other parts of our nation when it comes to teaching Black history. So let's first start off with, if you believe we are adequately teaching Black history in general, regardless of AP African American Studies courses, which we'll get into.
Well, I mean, I think that a little bit of what you just said, which is, I think that there's obviously a way in which we need to ensure that Black history is incorporated into, the teaching of history throughout the year. I think part of the problem is that when you reduce an entire people's history down to 1 month or 1 week, in cases of other constituencies in this country, you sort of diminish the impact. And so I think that Black History Month is important to highlight and to remind us of the contributions of Black Americans to our democracy and to the growth and development of our country. It's also important that it be incorporated throughout the year into, curriculums at every level. Part of the challenge that we're seeing right now, obviously, is the attempt to erase Black history, to not allow, right, the discussion of Black history in places across the country. And that obviously has some real serious implications, not just for how we understand our history as a country, but how we understand each other as individual people and individual citizens in this country.
We saw this school year that the College Board was going to finally run an advanced placement African American Studies course. And at the time when it was announced, there was a lot of celebration, a lot of joy that came from that. And then January came around and we saw Florida Governor Ron DeSantis announce that he and his administration would not be allowing the program to run in schools. What was your reaction when you first heard that news, and now as the saga has continued to unfold to revisions now to that program?
Right. Well, just an announcement just in time for Black History Month, right? Sort of insult to injury. I think that we focused a lot and we talked a lot about Florida, as we should. But I also think that it's important to remember when we first started having this conversation about removing, books from classrooms, when we first started talking about what the curriculum might look like in terms of teaching Black history as a nation, right? When we were focused on it, really was after the election in Virginia. In 2021. And we know that the governor has made good on a lot of the promises that he made to his base in Virginia to revamp what kids are learning in class. I think whether that is, the removal of books that are important literature, or simply just the rhetoric, I think is really damaging. So I think it's important, certainly, that we talk about what's happening in Florida, but we also should keep our eye on what's happening in states across the country. I was obviously unsurprised, as many people were, when Governor DeSantis, rejected the AP curriculum. But this is, again, the problem that we face in this country. And I really appreciate the back and forth conversation between you and Demario about what we can learn from history. And I was really just kind of happened upon this archival article in the New York Times the other day from, I think, 1859. And it was essentially an article that was addressing a New York Times piece that was addressing the abolitionist movement, obviously the abolition of slavery. And essentially the article was saying that we should just not talk about slavery. If we don't talk about it, it will eventually go away because the bad doers, the slaveholders will eventually, sort of crumble to their own, in their own moral decay. Well, that's obviously not how you end serious problems in this country, is by simply not talking about them. And I feel like we're back at that place again, as Demario suggested in that when you were talking about January 6th, where you have an entire segment of our population and political leadership who are saying, let's just not talk about racism. let's just not talk about bigotry. If we don't talk about it, if we talk about it, we give it life. And if we don't talk about it, then it will go away. That's not how it works. And I think that we know that we fundamentally have to understand our history. We have to address our history in order to not make the same mistakes, which we seem to be content to do over and over again. And it is also this thing that I said about, not just about how we understand our history, how we understand the contributions of different constituencies in this country to our history, but it's also how we understand each other. And one of the things that I have some deep concern about is that when we remove the reality, the real teaching of how this country has attempted to shape its democracy, sort of drive itself to a more perfect union, when we erase the really difficult and hard parts that were traumatic and violent in some cases, we don't allow our young people to have a conversation that allows them to develop empathy. So there's one part of it that certainly is about just, not knowing, which is, we are not trying to, we should not be encouraging ignorance. But there's another part of our history and teaching our history that is absolutely about developing empathy for other people in our country. And when we take that away, when we say we're not going to talk about it because we don't want you to understand what other people have gone through in this country, then we begin to really erode the fabric of our nation. And I think that when we look back to the summer of 2020 and the massive historic protests that we saw in the wake of George Floyd's murder, a lot of what we saw was a great deal of empathy that people were able to express, because not just because of that particular incident, but prior incidents, and the fact that they were engaged in conversations with their peers, that white students were engaged in conversations with their peers of color, their Black peers specifically, about the challenges of racism that they face on a day-to-day basis. And removing that from our schools, I think it will do real damage to how we understand each other and how we learn and learn to respect the challenges that different communities in our country have faced.
We're talking about education, but obviously education has become a very politicized topic, especially much more recently. How has that come up now with your work with Black PAC? Do these conversations happen with voters that you're talking to, or these pieces of legislation that we're seeing, are they spurring voters to be more politically engaged, turn up to the polls? How is it affecting the people that you're speaking with?
Yeah, well, I think that it is shocking but not surprising that when we see these conversations in the press and in the media about, removing, books or banning books and adjusting curriculum when it comes to teaching Black history, oftentimes we don't see Black parents being spoken to. Right? We don't see Black parents as being the ones, or parents of color in general being the ones who are being interviewed. And so it creates this misconception about who was concerned about what is being taught in schools. Certainly when we talk to folks, when we talk to voters on the doors or through the polling or focus groups that we do, we know that this is a huge issue for Black parents. Not just, education in general, right? And access to quality education is a top issue concern for Black voters. But we also know that this attempt to erase Black history is deeply concerning. The folks know that what it was like when they grew up, right? Particularly when we're talking about older generations, or even for me, I remember what it was like sitting in classrooms where when Black history was taught during the month of February, it was a very distorted history. And we've come a long way since then, thanks to a lot of, important academics, intellectuals, and teachers themselves in inserting Black history in a much more holistic way. But Black parents are very concerned about it. They're concerned that their children are, not being taught proper history. They're concerned that the erasure of Black history in schools makes their children feel like their history is unimportant. So there is this, diminishing of Black children when we say we're gonna ban books, and that we're going to change curriculum, and that we're not going to allow certain, historical figures to be talked about. So it's both diminishing for their children, and they're concerned about the overall education. And it's a really big issue, and we should be talking to more Black parents about it.
Absolutely. We're seeing this education fight. It's now also gone up to the Supreme Court level, where we saw earlier last fall a debate around or oral arguments for affirmative action or against affirmative action for affirmative action. Now we're having, as you mentioned, we already had discussions about book banning. Now we have the discussion about whether or not Black history shouldn't be taught. This is a lot of stuff, a lot of legislation happening that is impacting Black communities. Are you able to speak toward if you've conversed with legislators about their thoughts on how this is affecting, particularly when you think of Democratic voters and Democratic leaders, and Black voters often lean Democratic? Are legislators that you've spoken to responding or concerned about what we're seeing take place in our education fields?
Yeah, I think that, so I think that elected officials in general are progressive, often Democratic, are very clear about what's happening right now. And I think in some cases are clear about what the response is. But I think that it's important that we understand this in the broader context too, really outside of just education, right? In the conversation around education, one of the things that we talk about with voters all the time when we're out in the field and knocking on doors and engaging them in different ways throughout the year really is about trying to make sure that we connect the dots between elections and policy. Right. Demario talked about the big ramp up before Election Day. And one of the things that I think we do a disservice to voters and to the American public in general is when we focus on Election Day as if that is the sole moment when democracy happens. It is not. It is, the day after Election Day, as I often say, is as equal, if not more important, because that's the moment when we start to talk about how we, make policy, make laws that are going to have real impact on people's lives. And so whether we talk about some of the issues that we've seen as top concerns for Black voters, whether it is education, whether it is, the racial wealth gap, right? Whether it is voting rights, whether it is, police reform. We know that there are any number of policies at the federal level, at the state level, at the local level that are important for our elected leaders to be leading on, right? To be moving forward, to be advancing, so that not only we're closing racial wealth gaps across all of those, kind of markers, but that we are making sure that we're advancing, whether it's education policy or it's economic policy or it's environmental policy, right, in a way that addresses, the real needs and concerns of communities. And I think that legislators, for the most part, the folks that we have helped to elect, understand that. But we also find ourselves in a really, bad situation, quite frankly, in terms of our country right now, and the voices that are out there that are drowning out, voices of reason and those of us who support democracy. And I think that we have to be really careful because, again, it's not just education, but it's a whole range of issues that, frankly, there's this sort of umbrella, this sort of overarching issue I know that Black voters are very concerned about, and other folks in the country as well, that frankly is just the rise of white supremacy and racism and discrimination in our country that has to be pushed down. And if we don't push it down and push back on it, we actually end up with where we are right now, having a discussion about banning books that I'm certain that, a whole two generations thought that they'd never be in a position where we're having this conversation in our country, and it obviously affects every issue, every aspect of our country, and certainly affects our democracy. And we're at a place, I think, where we need to just call evil by its name. I think that we also have to stop referring to this as culture wars. It's not culture wars, it's racism and bigotry. And we need to call it that. And if we don't, we actually won't be able to address the impacts. And we're seeing them, very, very clearly right now.
Powerful perspective from Adrienne Shropshire, Executive Director of Black PAC. Adrienne, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you so much for this opportunity.
We now turn the discussion toward building economic power. Today, racial disparities still exist across the labor market, and there is still disproportionate access to capital and growth opportunities for Black business owners. Systemic inequities still limit access to home ownership as well. I'm pleased now to welcome economist Derek Hamilton to discuss economic equity and closing the racial wealth gap. Hamilton is the Henry Cohen Professor of Economics and Urban Policy and the founding director of the Institute on Race, Power, and Political Economy at the New School in New York City. Thank you for being with us today, Derek.
Thank you. An honor to be on this stage.
Wonderful. Well, when we talk about economic disparities, particularly racial economic disparities, what does that mean? What are we talking about?
I mean, we need only look at the wealth gap to see how vivid disparities are. And in earnest, if we were to summarize the racial disparities in economic terms, the racial wealth gap, where the typical Black household has often less than a dime than a typical white household, and that these disparities rise with education, so that it's not uncommon that Black households where the head graduated from college will have less wealth than those that are white, whose head dropped out of high school. I mean, that's a problem, and that's an example of this disparity, largely because not only wealth as an outcome, but what wealth can do for one's life. So the agency that's afforded to people because they have capital, because they have economic might, illustrates that we have people that are divided largely on something that is, I don't want to use the word cursory as it relates to an aesthetic, as it relates to a history and a culture, but as it relates to a transaction, something as cursory as one's phenotype of race or race.
Do we know what is causing some of these disparities that we see when it comes to being able to build wealth? Is it lack of education, lack of job opportunity? What causes it?
The main ingredient for wealth building is capital itself. The various things that you mentioned are useful. If you have a job that puts you in a pension, that provides automatic savings for you as you age towards retirement, that's useful. But at its core, it is wealth that begets more wealth. So we have a history. We emphasize property rights in this current economic paradigm, as opposed to economic rights for people. Now, the problem with property rights and that emphasis is that it's often examined in an ahistoric manner. So if we were to look historically over the course of this nation, we can see that Black people have been denied access to capital, that the government interventions, as well as private interventions that have afforded one set of people access to capital was not afforded to Black people. And we can go through and name the litany of it. But here's another point. Even when Black people have been able to overcome barriers and accrue resources, historically it has been vulnerable, not politically protected in the ways that the wealth of white people has. Examples are Tulsa, Oklahoma, where we know that race massacre that took place in 1919 was an example where whatever capital that Black people had accrued was lost. I mean, we can go through other examples as well. We can look at the great land loss of Black farmers throughout American history, which is indicative of a U.S. Department of Agriculture, as well as other malfeasance that have defrauded them out of their property.
Listening to these, some of these reasons for why we still have this racial wealth gap, Senator Cory Booker and Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley recently reintroduced baby bond legislation. Can you talk a little bit about what baby bond legislation is and how it could help address some of these inequities we've just been discussing?
Thank you. I mean, and that baby bonds gets at the root of the problem, right? We led with capital is the root of the problem if one is to generate wealth. Well, baby bonds provides a trust account at birth for everyone. So it seeds capital as a birthright. So that is in the domain of economic rights directed at people. So this is an example of a policy where, based on the family economic position in which one is born, an account is established at birth, and that account accrues greater resource over time and is protected in a similar way that Social Security is protected, so that when that child ages into adulthood, they have some nest egg so that they can generate the benefits that's afforded to other people who are born into resource, namely some capital to purchase a home as a down payment, some capital to invest in a debt-free college education, some capital to start a business. I mean, what we know is that however much effort and however much ingenuity an individual might have, it's limited without capital. So that's the aim of this policy. And, I'll say one last thing, and that is, it's not so novel. It's not so novel in the sense that we don't have an American history where we've seen similar policies of government foundations of capital that have afforded people the capabilities of building wealth. So at issue was those policies that came out of a New Deal, those policies that came out of a World War II with a GI Bill. They were not administered, distributed, or designed in a way that was race inclusive. So we have examples of success in American history. I think right now, I applaud Senator Booker and Representative Presley for putting forth a policy grounded in that history that can provide a way forward of government providing an economic rights foundation for its people, not simply for consumption purposes, but to enhance capabilities, and to do it in a way that's explicitly anti-racist or racially inclusive.
I can't help but think of when we're talking about baby bonds and the way that it would help to close that racial wealth gap. It would help to establish sort of that fund that is needed, as you mentioned, whether that's for college, for home, buying your first home. It also leads me down, we're going to get into a little tricky right now, reparations, which have obviously been a huge conversations that have been going for so long. How do baby bonds and reparations, when we talk about economic closing that racial economic disparity, how could reparations and baby bonds together, separate? Is there a way to have them linked together?
Yeah, I mean, I love that question. And I'll also state that there is no silver bullet policy for providing economic prosperity and a well-functioning economy, that there's a slew of policies that need to be enacted. But thinking about reparations and baby bonds, they're not substitutes, rather they're complements. What reparations does that baby bonds doesn't do is it includes the truth and reconciliation. And in earnest, it would be a more direct, parsimonious way to redress the racial wealth gap. But that truth and reconciliation accompanied by material redress would provide new narratives for public policy, not one grounded in deficits amongst the lower earning populations or the populations on the bottom. We get rid of some of those myths around deadbeat dads, welfare queens, and predators, and rather understand inequality from what it is sourced by, which is resource deprivation. So that truth and reconciliation about Black people will not only benefit Black people, but white people and public policy in general. But the redress would be specific to Black people and would be a direct way to redress the racial wealth gap. But let me say this, reparations wouldn't be enough either, because it's a retrospective policy. It needs to be complemented by something like baby bonds, which in a prospective way, in a forward-looking way, ensures that however capital consolidates in the future, and it will consolidate in the future, both economic power, political power, and capital in general, there is an automatic stabilizer, so to speak. There is a permanent policy that ensures that capital is distributed in a more just way. And reparations, unfortunately, won't do that. It will be a great step forward and something that's vitally useful, but it needs to be complemented with something like baby bonds. And vice versa, baby bonds, these are all good policies and we should not stand in the way of them going forward. But if we're ever to reckon with our racial history, if our racial disparity, and then, the original sin of America in general, it is necessary that reparations is ultimately enacted.
One of the topics of conversation that folks have discussed, especially much more recently for helping close the racial wealth gap, is student loan debt relief. And we'll actually be hearing oral arguments for student loan debt relief next week. Talk a little bit about when we say that could help close the racial wealth gap. How does helping forgive student loans affect Black Americans enough that it can help bridge that gap just a little bit?
Yeah, and I want to be careful here. We've become somewhat creatures of our success in moving to the lexicon the importance of closing the racial wealth gap. In practice, getting rid of student loan debt will have an impact on the racial wealth gap, but it'll be somewhat limited, largely because the main component of the racial wealth gap, in an accounting sense, is the asset difference, the difference in asset ownership between Blacks and whites. But nonetheless, we absolutely need to really have a jubilee with regards to student loan debt. And then we need to enact a policy that provides a debt-free college education, public education for everyone, so we don't end up in this problem again. In other words, the problem of debt, the albatross of basically making a person an indentured borrower for something as critical in the 21st century as a college degree, is immoral and actually counterproductive for a fair, efficient economy that provides pathways for everyone to be striving to be their best selves. So, just to summarize real quick, getting rid of the albatross of debt on our young people is reason enough. And if we consider the racial dimensions, we have Black people where we tell them your pathway to mobility is to get a college degree. All you got to do is get a college degree. And by the way, let me just reiterate that a college degree is important in and of its own self, but it won't be enough. But nonetheless, we encourage them to get a college degree, which is right. It costs them more to get that college degree because of the existing racial wealth gap. And then also because of discriminatory elements in our society, the rate of return on that college degree for Black people is less than that of their white counterparts. So something we should not do is impose that albatross of debt on Black people in particular, but young people in general.
I hear us talking about some of these policies ideas, right? This idea of forgiving student loan debt, baby bond legislature. I can't help but ask, are we at least on the right track toward economic equity?
I think so, but there's a cautionary tale. As you've been speaking with some of your other guests, when we're talking about banning books, the cautionary tale is that we're on the precipice of something dramatically worse than what we currently have if we go one pathway. But there's a bright spot, there's a silver lining, even from this pandemic. I mean, during this pandemic, the IRS remarkably sent direct income to people with somewhat relative ease compared to what we could have imagined that they did, without which, imagine our society if we didn't send out those checks to individuals. We would have went into a deep depression. So that might have been unheard of as a response, say 10 years ago. So I'm seeing that. I mean, we had the refundable child tax credit. We had that enacted. Unfortunately, it was not made permanent. But consider that in the context of welfare reform, and you see me put the air quotes up in, when 20 years ago, we could not fathom sending money directly to poor people. Rather, we just wanted to discipline them. So there are inklings and some silver linings of some policy apparatus that are a break or different from this past 40 to 50 years of perhaps neoliberalism, where we've had this dogma, this faith that all we have to do is invest in corporations and it'll trickle down to all of us. Provide tax breaks, which, by the way, is a government expenditure, that if that's all we did, that would lead to what's best for society, and then we would all be good. Well, we are learning that there's other ways to invest in our society. There's a human rights economies approach. There's an industrial policy approach that government invests directly in our most treasured resource, and that is our people. Invest in people and the places they live and watch them thrive and watch them create a dynamism where we all benefit. We're starting to see that take place. I mean, we need that momentum, and we need not let the despair of politics sway us away from demanding from our government that we continue down that path. And then one other element, that we do it in a way that's anti-racist, that's anti-sexist, that we ensure when we design these policies, that when we implement and manage these policies, that we're not doing it in a way that's exclusionary to populations that are absolutely deserving and that have been excluded in the past.
Yes, yes. Thank you, Mr. Derek Hamilton, for being here with us today. We enjoyed your insight.
Thank you.
Winning southern states like Georgia has swayed the congressional majority in recent elections. Joining me now to discuss the progress made in Black political leadership and the continued fight for social justice are the co-founders of the Black Voters Matter Fund, Ms. Latasha Brown and Mr. Cliff Albright. Welcome to you both.
Thank you for having us.
Yes, thank you so much for being here. We just came out of the 2022 midterms, and it was a bit contentious in some areas. We were hearing a lot of concern about things like voter suppression, voter intimidation. Can you just talk a little bit about where you feel voting rights currently stand in our country?
Cliff, you want to get started?
Sure. So yeah, thanks for having us. Of course, a lot has been written and said and reported on in regards to the wave of voter suppression bills that started to sweep the country, going back years actually to the gutting of the Voting Rights Act a few years ago, but, really becoming more pronounced in 2021 after the election of 2020, after the spread of the big lie. We saw voter suppression bills in 49 states introduced, passed in around 20. We then saw another wave coming in 22, and there's a whole nother wave coming right now as we speak in 2023. The insurrection, the slow motion insurrection did not end on January 6th. And so we're still seeing waves of bills to make it harder to vote in every phase, making it harder to vote during early voting, making it harder to vote by mail, making it harder to vote on election day. And so we're continuing to see new ways that they're trying to come up with, including new ways to just outright intimidation. Of course, we're familiar with what's been going on in Florida, where Governor DeSantis literally arrested 20 people for registering to vote, when in fact it was the state that encouraged them, told them that they could get registered, approve their registration, approve their votes, and then they wind up getting arrested. That's almost the definition of entrapment. And so, but it's not just Florida. We're seeing it sweeping all across the country. And what we always try to remind people of is that we're seeing this wave. We're seeing this backlash, not because Black voters are not turning out, not because we don't have political power, not because our groups aren't doing a good job of organizing folks. We're seeing this backlash because the exact opposite is true, is in response to our strength. It's in response to voters, Black and brown and other marginalized voters that impacted the 2020 election, came back in Georgia and did it again last year in the Senate election, in states all across the country. And so that's when people cheat, right? We always say nobody cheats when they're winning. People cheat when they're losing, and that's what's going on with voter suppression in the country.
You touched on what we saw happen in Georgia. We saw Georgia come through, elect Senator Raphael Warnock to give Democrats that majority in the Senate. How important were Black voters in not only turning Georgia blue in 2020 for Joe Biden, but then going into the midterms for Raphael Warnock?
I think that we were incredibly important, but I want to say that it's not just about the election around whether it's blue or red around the parties. I think that we also have to recognize if we want a strong democracy, then you have to have participatory citizenry. And so part of what we're seeing, I think Black voters were absolutely key and critical in the Georgia election, but I also think that they're key and critical on the survival of democracy in this nation currently, right? And I think when you see Black organizers, but I think that that we understand. I'm coming from a people who have a long history of oppression, have a long history of being excluded. We understand policies. We have a particular kind of understanding of policies that exclude us and what the ramifications of that are. And so I think part of what you see is I think Black voters really understand the larger picture, that not just on the local elections, and we're talking about the federal elections, but that Black voters are critical and key in terms of protecting democracy in this nation and being able to support progressive policies that would not only benefit our communities, but all communities, particularly working class and poor people that are often left out of the process.
Can I add on to that just for a second?
Absolutely.
Because Latasha brought up such a critical point, right? We often see that when Black voting rights or Black rights in general are attacked, it's the entire country that suffers, right? We suffer disproportionately, and be clear, it's based in anti-Blackness. But let's take, for example, the insurrection on January 6th, right? People say that they try to overturn democracy, they try to overturn an election, but we need to be clear. They weren't really trying to overturn an entire national election. What were they really upset about? They were trying to overturn votes in Pennsylvania. Well, we're in Pennsylvania, in Philadelphia, right? Black voters. They were upset about states like Georgia, right? Find me 11,700 votes, right? But it wasn't all of Georgia. They were upset about Atlanta, Fulton County, right? Black voters. They tried to throw out the votes in Michigan, but not all the votes in Michigan. They only wanted to throw out Wayne County, and more specifically, Detroit and Wayne County, right? Black voters. And so what starts as anti-Blackness, what is directly laser focused on us, it's only a matter of time before it infects the entire system, the entire democracy. That's why it's really an issue that everybody has to take more seriously.
We've mentioned a few times today that we saw record numbers of Black candidates running in the 2022 midterms. How does seeing that representation affect Black voters? Does it push them to the polls more? Does it, encourage them to throw their support behind candidates and be more politically involved when they see somebody who looks like them?
I think it goes beyond just around it looks like them, because Herschel Walker technically looked like us, but Black voters were very clear about he did not represent our interests. I think Black voters are far more sophisticated than people give us credit for, that fundamentally we were able to actually connect with a candidate or candidates. We have an expectation that there were candidates that will be in office that will protect our interests, and that we have an expectation that those that do not protect our interests, whether they look like us or not, that is no value of us. We've been very critical as a community of those candidates that have put their head in the ring and have not necessarily supported our interests. And so I think what you see is, I think it's always, when you look at the caliber of Black candidates, I think one of the things for us to talk about is not just that more Black candidates are running. What you're seeing is more progressive Black candidates run. When you're looking at people like Ayanna Pressley, when you're looking at folks who are literally coming forth and saying, yes, we've got to actually make some major fundamental changes in the system, that we literally have to have criminal justice reform. We need voting rights like Senator Raphael Warnock. And so what you're seeing is, I think there are three things. One, I think the representation absolutely matters, because what we recognize is that when people come from a certain experience, it actually shapes their perspective of life. It shapes their perspective of the political landscape. And so that's very important to us. The second thing is, I think you're starting to see progressive younger candidates like in Florida and other places that are running for office and seeking and winning these offices, because we need a new message. We're looking for candidates that are not just saying, I'm going to stop the boogeyman of what's happening now, but that literally we have to stop some policies, but also we have to be forward thinking. I think that's the other thing. And I think the third thing is, I think that we are demanding candidates that have some relationship in community. That what we're seeing is that there is a need for people to actually see folks be more accountable. And I think you're going to see younger candidates. I think you're going to see candidates that are that oftentimes you would not have considered, some may not have considered electable. You're seeing candidates as young as 23 years old, run for office, for Congress, and win. And so I think it's really important that what we're seeing is, I think it's not just Black candidates. I think we're bringing an entirely new political paradigm and representation to the table for all Americans.
You mentioned young candidates running, and it made me think of Representative Maxwell Frost, who's the youngest representative elected. He's also Afro-Cuban. What are you hearing from young Black voters, especially coming out of 2022, especially gearing up already for 2024? How are they feeling about their political power at this point in time?
Yeah, I think, we saw in 22, we saw a large turnout. We saw it here in Georgia, particularly with the Senate race. We saw it in 20. But in 22, we saw it across the country. And I think it sends I think it teaches a lesson, right? Who would have thought that when you actually respond to the issues that young folks care about, that you'll actually increase young voter turnout, right? And so what did we see? We saw one of the largest investments in green economies and in climate change, right? Young folks care about that issue, right? Black young folks in particular, what do we care about? We care about police violence. And also, although we haven't seen the passage of the George Floyd Act or the Breathe Act or something at the federal level, we did see some federal action on criminal justice reform, not the least of which was we saw a Department of Justice that made sure that those who killed Breonna Taylor would face justice. That does not happen if you don't have massive Black voter turnout in 2020 and 2022. Young folks responded to that, right? We saw that after a lot of delay and debate that we saw some action, not as much as I and others would like to see, but we saw some action in regards to debt cancellation. You just spoke with Professor Hamilton about the impact that has in terms of the racial wealth gap. Young Black voters, young Black students, Black youth in general care about that issue. And so for all these reasons, when you address our issues, and this goes for every age group, young, older, or whatever, when you address our issues, then we tend to turn out in terms of voter mobilization. All we ask for from policymakers, make our jobs easier, encouraging our folks to vote by showing that accountability, by responding to our issues. Those conversations at the door become a lot easier when we can show that the folks that we voted for in the past have actually responded to our issues.
I want to look forward just a little bit to 2024 because we are already hearing candidates announce their campaigning. As that starts to happen, as we get closer to 2024 and that election cycle, in what ways is Black Voters Matter starting the organizing at this moment and starting the encouragement and the mobilization of your constituents now?
So I'll start and I'll turn it over to Cliff as well so we can both weigh in on this question. One, I think that we have to recognize that part of our work is not just episodic about one election. Our work is 365 days out of the year. We are focused on how do we build Black political power, and that whether there's a presidential election happening or not, it's really important. There's always an election. There's no such thing as an off year. So this year we are working just as if it was 2024 or 2022 or 2020 where there was a midterm election, because we know that there are critical local races and elections that are happening. And also we know it's really important to build the infrastructure and the ecosystem of communities that are engaged, because fundamentally we know that we're in protracted struggle, that in order for us to make the kind of change that we need to make, that fundamentally it is going to take us literally being relentless in supporting and pushing an agenda that supports us. And so Cliff, I'll turn it over to you. You may want to highlight some of the work that we're doing now.
Yeah, Latasha took the words right out of my mouth, right? We always say there's no such thing as an off year. There was an election yesterday, right? Some people have called it the most important election in the country. It took place yesterday in Wisconsin, where they were voting in a primary for their Supreme Court vacancy that's coming up, right? You can't just mobilize for 2024 by waiting for 2024. You've got to be engaged. We call it the 365 work. You've got to be engaged all throughout the year. And that includes not just being engaged in elections of all types, including primaries like what happened yesterday, not just elections on federal offices, but including those local level, right? The county commissioners, the DAs, the mayors, the city councils. We always say you can't come knocking on my door every 4 years or come knocking on my door in late October and November saying that you need my vote to save democracy, but you weren't there for me in February when we had an election for our Supreme Court, which impacts every decision, every issue that affects my life, right? Don't come knocking on my door in 2024 if you weren't there for me in 2023 when we had a city council race or a mayor's race and we're dealing with. Don't come knocking on my door if I live in Mississippi and you weren't there when they were talking about dirty water or forming a jurisdiction that takes power away from Black folks in Jackson, Mississippi, but then you want to come knocking on my door in November or in 2024. And so we have got to be present and investing in this work. There are incredible groups doing amazing work and doing it severely under-resourced. That's why we started Black Voters Matter Fund, because Latasha and I, we knew what it was like to be in a community like that, in a red state, in a rural community, doing great work that was under-resourced. And so we have got to support these these groups. We've got to support these candidates. We've got to redefine what it means to be electable. And we've got to do all of that starting right now, not waiting until the first primary, which, we'll be glad to see will be in South Carolina. But we can't wait until 2024 to start talking about that. We've got to do this work all throughout the year, including in the odd number years.
When we talk about building Black political power, of course, a very large portion of that is organizations like your own. It includes Black voters who are showing up to the polls, but it also includes Black leaders, our policymakers. And for instance, just last night, we saw Congresswoman-elect McClellan in Virginia was elected as well. And so we're seeing like the Congressional Black Caucus welcoming its largest class in its history. How encouraging is it to see these gains, and how do we keep that momentum going toward the future?
It's really encouraging to see the gains, but more so than while I'm excited and happy for this new win, what makes me more excited is that Black voters showed up and showed out. And I think part of what we have to recognize is that sometimes we've built a democracy that in many ways, the focus has been on elected leadership. And once you put them in office, go back to your corners and everything's going to work out. We've seen in our community that doesn't work. That part of what we have to do is really build a way that we're not just getting people to engage in the electoral process, but there has to be a strong accountability process. We've seen that to be able to make sure that our votes are actually turning into kind of the policy changes that we want. And I do believe that we are in a particular moment in time, that in any moment in time, that there is a moment that we literally, with the rise of racial tension, when we're seeing anti-Blackness, that people are actually campaigning, they're building entire campaigns off anti-Blackness, that this is the moment that Black voters have to stand up. We have to organize ourselves. And I think where the real change is going to be, it is going to be when we have a strong ecosystem of grassroots organizers and organizations that are well-resourced, that are embedded in communities, so that we can actually put people in office that need to be in office, and that we can take folks out when they're not aligned with our values or our agenda.
Ms. LaTosha Brown and Mr. Cliff Albright of the Black Voters Matter Fund, thank you both so much for being here today. We really appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
My next guest is Nevada's first Black representative in Congress. He also made history as the first Black majority leader of the Nevada State Senate, and he currently serves as chair of the Congressional Black Caucus. Welcome, Representative Stephen Horsford.
Thank you so much for having me on, Cheyenne.
Absolutely. Thank you for being here. It would not be Black History Month if we were not talking about history makers, and you are one of those history makers. I would love just to hear you discuss a little bit about your journey with the Nevada State Assembly, and if you knew at the time just how important and the gravity of your election was to the state of Nevada.
Well, I was born and raised here in Nevada, Las Vegas. This is my home, it's my community, and I'm just honored to be able to continue to serve. Before I was ever elected to anything, I worked in my community, running the state's largest employment and training agency, a nonprofit organization that helped thousands of people get careers in good paying jobs. That is what motivated me to want to do more. I actually started in the Nevada State Legislature as an intern in college, and that is what helped expose me to public policy and the fact that there was a role for me to help effectuate positive change in my community. And that is why I'm always encouraging young people to explore opportunities through fellowships, through internships, because that's what's going to ultimately determine their success.
Absolutely. Congressman, we just came out of the 2022 midterms where we saw record numbers of Black Americans running for both parties up and down the ballot, record numbers being elected. Talk about just how important it is that we see this representation increasing, but also how we can keep that momentum going forward.
Really honored to serve as the chair for the Congressional Black Caucus. We have the most members that we've ever had in the history. At 57, we'll have one more member joining us, Jennifer McClellan in Virginia. She's actually running today for her election, and we'll know the results of that by the end of the month, and we'll be at 58 members. But we're also looking to see that we have the highest number of people from diverse districts that are not predominantly African American in population, or in the case of my district, for example, it's a majority minority district, and so it's about a coalition of support that's helped those of us get elected. We have 9 new members joining us in the Congressional Black Caucus. Our first Gen Z representative, Representative Maxwell Frost from Florida. And we're very excited to have such a young, dynamic leader, along with the other new members who are joining the Congressional Black Caucus.
The CBC does a lot of work. One of the phrases that we often hear associated with the CBC is how they're the voice of our Congress, and they are really there to help represent and bring Black voices and Black issues to our legislators and our policymakers. How have you seen, or how do you feel that the CBC's agenda has perhaps grown or evolved since its inception so many years ago?
You're absolutely right. So the Congressional Black Caucus just celebrated our 50th anniversary. We're now in our 51st year, and I'm proud to be able to set a direction for the next 50 years. But to be clear, we stand on the shoulders of the 13 founders who started the Congressional Black Caucus back in 1971. And in our bylaws and in the creation of our organization, the mission is always about representing the communities who are oftentimes marginalized, ignored, or not at the table. That has changed and it has improved, but there's still much more work that we have to do. I'm focused, for example, on racial equity and justice to make sure, whether it's in education, in workforce, in housing and healthcare, in entrepreneurship and small business development, that we're actually moving the progress forward to make sure that the systemic issues that have left our community behind, they don't continue to leave us out when it comes to outcomes on racial equity in these key areas of quality of life.
You know, when we discuss economic equity, a big thing, as you mentioned, is when we talk about equitable housing opportunities, when we talk about home ownership. Why is home ownership and access to equitable housing so important when it comes to things like building generational wealth?
You know, Cheyenne, thank you so much for asking this important question. During the implementation of the GI Bill, one of the things that people don't know is Black veterans weren't included in the benefits and didn't receive equitable treatment of those benefits, which helped create wealth for our veterans who were coming back from war. Many of them who bought homes for the first time, that helped their family enter the middle class. It allowed them to build equity. A lot of people use that equity to put their kids through college, to start a small business for themselves or their family. And that's traditionally how people have built wealth. Well, generationally for Black people, we haven't had the same opportunity for that wealth creation. And so that is why issues of home ownership, housing equity, eradicating homelessness are so important. We made history just recently with one of our members becoming the mayor of Los Angeles, Karen Bass, and one of her key priorities is the issue of housing, eradicating homelessness, and making sure that we're providing home ownership opportunities to more families, because that is about improving people's wealth and passing that wealth down to the next generation of our children and children's children.
We have seen reports come out about appraisals, home appraisals, where we're seeing racial discrepancies in how Black homes are appraised versus white homes. Is there something that you see Congress being able to do to step in and make sure that these discrepancies don't continue?
Absolutely. Again, I want to commend one of our former members and chairs of the Congressional Black Caucus, Secretary Marcia Fudge, who oversees housing and urban development. She's actually tackling this issue of the inequity of home appraisals, which again is treating Black homeowners differently than other homeowners. It's not fair that in the same neighborhood for the same size home, that a Black home could be appraised at considerably less amount compared to a counterpart. So with the leadership of Secretary Fudge and members of the Congressional Black Caucus, I serve on the Housing Subcommittee on Financial Services, and this is one of the priorities that the Secretary to move this issue forward. It's an issue of fairness. We're not trying to say we want something different than any other community. We want the same equitable treatment and appraised value for our homes as anyone else's home in any other neighborhood, regardless of zip code, regardless of community.
A big part of racial justice, racial equity is also education. Now, right now, we are seeing a little bit of a fight play out when it comes to some of the student loan forgiveness plans that are out there. We have, of course, heard President Biden is forgiving up to $20,000 in student loans. How important, when we think about opportunities, whether that's job opportunities or home ownership opportunities, is closing the racial discrepancies when it comes to access to education?
So the issue of college affordability is a huge issue when it comes to racial equity. I want to commend a number of our members, including Representative Ayanna Pressley, who has worked tirelessly to bring voice to this issue of the student debt crisis. About 70% of the students and families who are getting that $20,000 loan forgiveness are on Pell Grants. That means they have an income requirement to even qualify to receive a Pell loan. These are students and families who are typically low or moderate income. They're families that are working to improve their education and their skills, and no one should have to go into debt or have mountains of loans coming out of college simply to invest in their abilities and to have the skills to enter the workforce or to start their own business. So we commend the president for doing what he could on the executive order basis, but we are calling on Congress to go further around the issue of college affordability. We believe that the access to community college should be open to everyone. We believe that apprenticeship models should be more accessible because they provide an avenue for many people, particularly in the Black community, to develop the skills while on the job. We also believe that we should provide assistance for shorter term training because you don't necessarily need a 2 or 4 year degree to acquire the skills for the jobs that are in demand today. So those are other measures that we're working on a congressional front to make college more affordable for all families, particularly Black families.
I want to touch again briefly when we just mentioned President Joe Biden. I want to go back to him very briefly because we just watched his State of the Union just this month, and not only did we see the family of Tyre Nichols at that State of the Union, we saw members of the CBC invite other families who have been horrendously impacted by police violence in attendance as well. Can you talk to me about why that was so important for the CBC to do that? And as I'm aware of, the CBC members actually had a meeting with President Joe Biden before the State of the Union about police brutality. Can you just talk to us a little bit about where the conversations with the CBC are at this moment?
Well, absolutely. And first, I had an opportunity to speak to the family of Tyre Nichols, the mother and the father, prior to the funeral, obviously extended our condolences and asked them what they wanted in this moment. And what they told us is to remind people who Tyre Nichols was. He was a son. He was a father of a 4-year-old child. He was a young man with a lot of potential. He loved skateboarding and he loved sunsets. and photography. In fact, he had just left taking photography of sunset when he was pulled over by those Memphis police officers, taken out of his car, brutally beaten, and died days later as a result. No one in any community should die because of a traffic stop in America. And what we've said as the Congressional Black Caucus is that bad policing shouldn't exist anywhere. And all of us should agree that bad policing has no place. And what we're calling for is a sense of public safety and accountability in every community, black or brown or white. This is not a Republican issue or a Democratic issue. It's a public safety and accountability issue. We did ask for a meeting with the president and the vice president. They accepted. We met with them. We asked the president to use the moment of the State of the Union address to speak to the hearts of the American people about why this issue is so important, particularly to Black people, because we're disproportionately affected by police incidents and police brutality. But it's not to the exception of our community, because it may have been Tyree Nichols yesterday. It could be any one of us today or tomorrow. And so I want to commend the president for using the moment to talk about why this issue of public safety and accountability is so important. And the fact that he used the reference of the talk that so many of us as parents of Black children have to give about how they have to comport themselves when they come into contact with law enforcement is something that was very important for the entire country to hear. It resonated, and I'm glad to see that so many of my Republican colleagues agreed with the need for accountability in policing in America. And we look forward to working with them in that in the months to come.
Congressman, just very quickly, thinking back through our discussion today about the work that you have ahead of you, that the CBC has ahead of it, how confident are you that we can see a racially equitable society finally come to reality?
Well, look, make no mistake about it. This is a very hard issue to confront. And it didn't happen, inequities on race didn't happen overnight in this country. It's based on the founding systemic issues from slavery to Jim Crow laws to now mass incarceration. And we understand that these are not easy issues. But as the president said, we can do big things. And I believe it is possible to create more racial inclusive policies that are more equitable. For example, when you look at areas of workforce or housing or healthcare, by being more intentional, by having data-driven policies, by promoting policies that make sure that no one is those who have been structurally marginalized, we can have more racially equitable policies. And that is what the Congressional Black Caucus is working towards. We are known as the conscience of the Congress, and we will continue to work for these policies for as long as they take, because we stand on the shoulders of those who had to work a whole lot harder to accomplish policies on civil rights, on fair housing, on voting rights. So this challenge on racial equity is no bigger than what those who have preceded us have had to fight for.
Representative Stephen Horsford, thank you so much for your time today. We so appreciate you coming on the show.
It's great to be on. Thank you for having me.
And that brings us to the end of our program. A big thank you to all of our guests and to all of you for watching. For those of you who missed any of the conversations this afternoon, we will have video from the event up on our website shortly. I'm Cheyenne Daniels. I hope you enjoyed the program and have a great rest of your day.